beautiful thing's a tank. Yes!
Hey, it's Vaz here from Aussie RC Playground and welcome to my official review of the ARRMA Kraton 8S. Now this is a 1/5 scale 4-wheel drive brushless monster truck with a Spectrum 4685 1250 kV brushless motor, a firmer 160 amp ESC and a Spectrum S905 steering servo up the front. Now my version, which was a pre-release version, came with the DX2E radio, which is paired up to an SR6100AT AVC receiver, but of course the current models of this car actually come with the DX3, which is a 3-channel radio, and it is a far superior radio than the one that I currently have. So as always, we're going to kick this off with the electrics, and for this score I gave it a 4 out of 5. Now I gotta be honest, I'm a little bit torn with the scoring on this because up until the 11th hour, until I started recording this video, I had it marked as a 3 out of 5, but I've switched it to a 4 out of 5 because I think ARRMA have done a couple of changes since this car's release that I think giving it a 3 might be a little bit harsh. But you can debate it in the comments and you can let me know whether or not I'm actually wrong on changing this to a 4, because here's my thinking on this. Right now, the original radio was the DX2E, and you know, this is a better radio than the SDX2, but it feels very much the same. It comes from the very same mold, I guess. It just uses a different protocol. And the protocol is much nicer. You know, the car's got AVC, it uses the DSMR protocol, which means I can bind this to my DX5C, which is what I've done. And you know, I don't really use that radio. I don't think I ever used that radio from day one. So it's a much better thing. Now, ARRMA have actually brought out the DX3, which is what these cars come with. It's what the Outcast 8S comes with now. The Infraction V2s, the Felonies, all of those sorts of, you know, high-end cars from ARRMA come with that DX3 radio, and it's a great radio. It's got a much better feel. It's got a foam wheel. It's got a little LED indicator on the back of the radio. It tells you when your battery is running low. All of these little positives, which is a great thing. So big step forward there. And then there's also been a firmware update on the firmer ESC, which apparently unleashes a little bit more power. It gives you a bit better throttle curve. So it brings, you know, the car to life a little bit more, and that's definitely a positive again. The servos seem to be holding up okay. I think the big issue here that I've seen so far, that I've heard about, is the servo saver kind of slows things down, and people seem to think that it's the actual servo that's the problem, and I think it might actually be the servo saver. So it could be 6 of one, half dozen the other, but I think the servo is holding up for the most part. The confusing thing about the servo though is that it's promoted as a 40 kilogram steering servo at 7.4 volts or 7.2 volts. But the firmer ESC BEC is actually locked at 6 volts. So the servo is not pulling 40 kilograms as advertised, at least based on the specs. I could be wrong. Again, correct me in the comments if I'm mistaken here, but that's my understanding of it. The firmer ESC itself is actually not a bad ESC. It's kind of like a rebranded Hobbywing Max 6, but it's got a few little extra bells and whistles because of the telemetry, and you know, all that smart tech that Spectrum have brought out. Of course, it's got different casing. It looks like a Spectrum unit, but I believe that at its core, it's really just a Hobbywing with a few extra little features for that telemetry. My biggest issue here is, of course, the motor. The motor for these cars is it's adequate, but I think it's only just adequate. This is a very heavy car. This car weighs 11 kilos dry, and when you load it up with a couple of big 4S batteries, it really starts to weigh in. And the electrics technically should really belong to a 1/6 scale. I don't think the motor size is really the size that should be in this car. I think it should be a much bigger diameter can, perhaps even a tad longer. Give this car a little bit more torque, and you should also be gearing this thing up a bit more. So there's a mismatch here of electrics. I don't think it's quite right. Now, that being said, people have geared it up, they've turned up the punch, they've updated their firmware, and even now you look at the Outcast 8S, which has the exact same electrics, it can do standing backflips. So it's not like the electrics are catching fire and failing, or people are seizing motors everywhere and it's not good enough. You can actually get some decent speeds out of this stock setup. I just feel that it's really on the cusp of, like, it's at the apex of what it can do. And I kind of wish that they would do something about the motor perhaps, or maybe switch out the entire system completely and have a proper 5th scale system in here. Now, I tried out my Max 6 combo, which is the 1100 kV combo, with a 32th pinion stock spur, and this thing was an absolute demon. So that's the kind of setup that, if you're going to stick to the 160 ampere-C, that's the kind of setup that I would sort of expect, and the kind of performance you'd expect out of the stock system. And it's just not delivering that. And now, of course, I've got the Max 5 combo in here. I've switched out the spur gear. I'm running a 39-39 combo, so I'm actually using the spool out of the Limitless, which is a 39 tooth, and the spool out of the Limitless, which is also a 39 tooth, as a pinion. So 39-39 is my gearing, because the motor is an 8mm shaft, and it seems to be working fine. I've sort of ran it up and down the driveway and in the front of my house. Lots of power. On an 8S, this thing's an absolute beast. And that's really the next level of performance from this car. So to really knock it to its knees with the 3, I thought maybe it was a bit harsh, especially since they've done some things to the ESC and they've updated the radio. So I'm going to switch it up to a 4, but I know that some people will dispute that. You let me know whether or not I'm wrong in switching it out to a 4, but that's where I'm going to leave the scoring for the electrics here. And that's pretty much how I feel about it. I just feel that this setup is really pushing it with the car of this size and weight in here. Yeah. I think that they can definitely do better. All right, so moving on to Drivetrain, and for this one, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Drivetrain's basically talking about bearings and diff problems and things like that. I think overall, a 4 out of 5 is actually a pretty good score for Drivetrain. I'm not going to give it full marks. I have seen the odd person kind of blow up a rear diff and so forth. So I'm going to leave this one not at 100%. I don't usually like to base my scores on other people's experiences, because I really haven't had any issues like that. But, they didn't include a spare pinion. There's been a couple of sort of ghosty diff issues that have been going on out there. I think a 4 out of 5, give them something to aspire to, is probably not a bad thing. I certainly would have liked to have seen a slightly smaller spur gear, just so that we can run a slightly bigger pinion in here as well. I've also would have liked to have seen a 5th scale motor mount already installed in this car, so that you could switch between the stock motor that's in here and very quickly flip the motor mount around, or do something like that, so that you could fit on a big 5th scale motor on here. Instead, you still have to buy the actual 5th scale motor mount as an additional piece, or you have to change out the motor mount entirely, like what I've got, which is the M2C Racing motor mount. So I'm going to leave this one at a 4 out of 5. I'm going to keep it real simple here. I wouldn't feel comfortable giving it a 5 out of 5 given everything. So that's where I'm going to leave this one. Now this one should be pretty easy. This is handling, and it's a 5 out of 5. I mean, it's a Kraton. I have to hand it to ARRMA. Nonetheless, I don't want to belittle their efforts here, because tuning a car this size, this heavy, to be able to handle as well as it does, that's a good effort. And to do that first time out, I think that's fantastic. So I mean, look, the blueprint was there, the DNA, you can sort of feel that this is definitely derived from, the 6S line, and they've got that tuned quite well. So they sort of knew what they were looking for with performance-wise in the handling department with this car, especially now they're using these big copperhead tires, which have been really popular on the Kraton 6S V4s, and of course the EXB as well. So the handling characteristics of this car has actually been fantastic. Low center of gravity monster truck, a lot of travel. It just handles really, really nice. There's really not a lot to nitpick on here. So that's a 5 out of 5 from me, easy one. So we're about halfway through this review, and the next category is durability. And for this score, I gave it a 4 out of 5. Now, I know that a lot of you are probably expecting me to give this a really low score, given my experience with the car, with the bent chassis and everything else. But we got to remember that ARRMA have actually done some improvements to the car to prevent this from happening again. And from what I understand it, there haven't been a lot of people complaining about bent chassis since they've done these updates. So I'll give you a very quick recap of what happened to the car. I got the car pre-release, as did a few other people out there. I'd done a running video with the car, and then when I got home, I thought everything was fine. I was actually loading up the batteries to go and do a speed test with the car the following day, and I noticed that the tower-to-tower brace was actually bent like a banana. When I realized that the brace was bent, I flipped the car upside down and my chassis was completely buckled. It was bent actually really badly. I sent the photos over to ARRMA, at which point they said, send the car back to us, we need to have a look at this and analyze what's going on, have a better look at the footage of that running video as well. Now this is before the car had even launched. So I sent the car back. It took quite a long time due to customs and being Christmas time and all of this sort of stuff. So it took a little bit of a long time to get the car back, but eventually they sent the car back to me and they gave me a brand new chassis, a brand new tower-to-tower brace, and it was ready to go again. But I was really hesitant in running the car as it was because I felt like the same thing was going to happen again. And it wasn't until several weeks later that I saw on the ARRMA forum that someone had bought a new Kraton and the bracing was different. And not only that, but there was an additional brace at the back of the Kraton. At which point I contacted ARRMA and they said, yes, we've updated the cars, but we haven't really called it a V2. So what they've done is they've introduced the rear chassis brace to the rear of the car. There's the tower-to-tower brace is now split in two, and it basically goes to that center tower, and this has increased the strength of the car considerably. Now, one other issue that I personally haven't had, but I've seen a few people have out there, are of course the A-arms. The A-arms, you know, as per normal, they have a little bit of webbing to them. They look really beefy, they look really tough, but people take enough hits or they hit them in the right way, and the A-arms tend to break. And on more than one occasion, I've seen the odd Facebook post come up saying, you know, I broke another A-arm. Well, sure enough, ARRMA have updated those as well. I recently noticed that the new Outcast 8S comes with a slightly different mold on the A-arms, and you know, it's the same length, it's the same arm, same part number, but a little bit of a different design. So ARRMA have also updated those A-arms to make them a little bit stronger by tightening up that webbing and giving us a little bit more solid plastic, not so many holes, or the holes are not as big as they were, I guess is what I'm saying. So it would be really unfair and very harsh for me to give this car a low score based on that sole experience when the car has now changed since then. What you're going to be getting today is not the same car that I got pre-release. So I have to score that accordingly. And you know, I'm not going to give it full marks. I know that ARRMA did an enormous amount of work to get those updates done. And you know, I have to congratulate them and applaud them for doing that. I think that's a fantastic thing, but I would be silly to give this full marks because you know, I haven't tested a stock car like that with those updates, you know, with the new arms and everything else. Perhaps in the next version I may have the opportunity to do that, and who knows, maybe we might get a 5 out of 5, but I'm going to leave it at a 4 out of 5 for now for durability. I hope you guys understand where I'm coming from with this. But yeah, if they hadn't made these changes, yeah, you'd probably be looking at a 2, at best a 3, but most likely a 2. So a 4, I think, is a very good score given everything that's happened. And that's where I'm going to leave it. All right, so moving on to maintenance. And for this one, I gave it a 3 out of 5 because I had a couple of issues with the maintenance scoring on this one. And here's my reasoning for it right now. The ESC is one thing that you kind of have to adjust. You got to turn the punch setting up and so forth. Now that may or may not be needed with the current firmware update that's coming with the you know, the next batch of these cars. So you know, if you've got a more recent Kraton 8S, maybe you can let me know in the comments if you still need to turn up the punch setting. I felt that it was definitely necessary, and it's something that I've really never had to do on any of the other cars. So to have to do it here, I don't know, to me kind of left itself to be a little bit criticized on that front. But you know, you may even need to, you know, you may even consider scratching that reason off the list. You do need to get an additional pinion for the car though, just to get any decent speed out of it. So that's an additional purchase that's a little bit, a bit annoying to have to do that. I certainly hope that future versions of this truck come with the extra pinion, because the ARRMA Outcast actually comes with a spare pinion now. So I can see this one hopefully coming out with an additional pinion as well for you to get a little bit more top speed. But the biggest issue I had with this car was the center diff itself and the maintenance that you had to do to it to get the car to perform decently. Stock out of the box, the center diff comes with 1 million CST. Now, at least that's how it was when I first got the car. I don't know if that has changed or not. Again, maybe you can correct me in the comments. But what a lot of people have been doing is, of course, changing out that oil. To do that, you've got to open up that center diff. Getting access to it and everything, it's a little bit tedious because there's a big transmission type thing going on in the middle there. It's not the same as the other 1/8 scale cars, and you can definitely understand why, because it's such a big, heavy car. You can't just put spur gear to pinion. You're going to smash everything. So to have a transmission in this actually makes sense. And the center diff is one hell of a beast. This is the housing of the center diff itself. Very, very cool component. I don't know if this is an original design from ARRMA or if they've sort of borrowed this design from somewhere else, but very, very cool. The spur gear on the outside kind of slides on and off out of the housing of the diff, which is kind of cool. And then of course you got to line it up again to get it back in there, and it can be a little bit tricky to do that. And then of course there's a front plate and front and rear plates that sort of go on here and lock everything into place with the gears in the middle. So a really cool, interesting design. I'm trying to slide this back. Here we go. Really cool, interesting design. So changing out the oil for this, some people have gone for the 20 million CST. Others have gone for silicon earplugs. I actually tried the 20 million first, and it actually performed pretty good. I have to say, if you have access to 20 million CST, and you don't really want to go muck around with silicon earplugs, use that. I think you'll be pretty happy with the performance. I used it, and then I put the silicon earplugs, slightly better. It kind of prevents the front tires from ballooning as bad as it was when I first got the car. The issue with all of that, changing a diff oil is usually not so much of a big deal. The issue is these bolts that they use, these 4 screws that they use on either side of the diff. These are M3.5, which is actually really tricky to find aftermarket screws for that. And why would you need to find aftermarket screws? Because I snapped 2 of them trying to take the housings off. Now you do need to apply a lot of heat to try and get these screws off. They use probably permanent Loctite or something like that, and the screws themselves are actually quite soft. I'm certainly no Hulk. I've got a little bit of forearm strength, but to be able to snap 2 screw heads quite easily, just tells me that there's an issue with the quality of the screws. If they can improve that quality of the screws, maybe it's not such a big deal, but trying to find M3.5 countersunk screws at the right length to go in here, really, really tricky to find in the open market. I looked in quite a few places, not just eBay, but a lot of fastener websites and so forth, and I couldn't find anything that was suitable for this. So I think ARRMA either need to switch out to an M4 or perhaps stick to an M3, maybe improve the quality of the screws, maybe use something like vibranium or something like that, to stop these from snapping off, because that's really frustrating. It's a lot of work to get to that diff only to have 2 screws snap off. Thankfully, mine snapped off at opposite ends. So on one side, I've got all 4 of them on there. The other side, I've only got 2. It's holding up okay. I'm hoping that I'm not, going to regret that at some stage in the future, and my diff's just going to pop open, and all sorts of stuff going to come out there. But the silicon earplugs, they're not going to leak. That's for sure, because it's basically like Play-Doh. So it should hopefully hold okay. But that's really why I gave this one a 3 out of 5 for maintenance. It's a fair bit of work to get all of this stuff done, and I hope that they correct that in the future. Moving on to the tail end of this review, of course, we have part support, and I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5 because surprisingly, there's actually quite a lot of parts available for this car here in the country. I really don't have any issues. In fact, I managed to get a spare diff. I was going to install this, but I couldn't get different screws to go on here. I didn't want to use the original screws, so I've kept this as a backup until I can find out a way that maybe I can find some screws in the future, or maybe tap this out to a different size we'll see what happens. But yeah, look, overall, I really don't have a lot of complaints. There's plenty of A-arms and plenty of bits and pieces, you know, to fix up this car. We've had a couple of people come into the shop with, you know, busted up front ends and stuff. No shortage of parts. I've even got the 5th scale servo mount adapter for this as well, which, you know, at some stage I'm probably going to switch out the servo just to really complete the whole electrics transplant. Yeah, I really don't have too much to complain about as far as part support. So again, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5. So closing out this review, we have value. And for this one, I'm actually going to give it a 3 out of 5. Now, 3 out of 5, I think, is basically meeting expectations here. It hasn't really blown me away as far as value, given the price that it is here in the country. And to give you all a bit of perspective, for those of you outside of Australia, this car retails here for about $15.99. You know, you might get a little bit cheaper on sale here and there, whatever, but it's about $1,600. Now, to put that into perspective, the Losi DBXLE 2.0 is about $1,900. The Losi 5T is about $2,300 from memory, so $2,299, somewhere like that. And that's a bind and drive, if I'm not mistaken, so it doesn't even come with the radio. So when you take into account where this sits in the 5th scale landscape, it actually sits at the bottom end, to be honest. The X-Max is about the same price these days. It was originally about $150 cheaper, but the X-Max has actually come up in price quite a bit, and it's about the same price, maybe $50 cheaper, somewhere around there. So not a huge difference in price by comparison. So it's actually quite an expensive car regardless. You know, this is something that is going to take a little bit of time to save up for here in Australia, especially for the average person. It's not a cheap car. And when you take into account, you know, that some people might be considering changing out the power system, or they might be considering a chassis upgrade, well then, you know, it's going to tip you well over the $2,000 mark, and you add batteries, this and that, the other. It's not a cheap investment, no matter which way you look at it. But it is at the cheaper end of that scale, as I said. With all of that being said, I think that there is definitely room for improvement to increase the value of this car. Everything staying as it is, if this was maybe $200 cheaper, like around $12.99, I think this would be, you know, the scoring would be quite different. Or if the price stays the same, but they had a bigger power system in here, like a proper 5th scale power system, again, I think the scoring would be quite different. So there's definitely room for improvement here. I'm not trying to belittle what ARRMA have done or what Horizon have done with this car by, you know, giving it a 3. I think it's on par. It meets kind of its expectations. It doesn't do anything outside of what it could do, if that makes a bit of sense. So that's why I'm going to leave it at a 3 out of 5 for value. You know, when you take into account, you know, the mods you have to do with the diff and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I'm going to leave it as it is, and just tally up everything. So the total score for this one is a 28 out of a potential 35, which equates to a flat 80%. So that's an 8 out of 10. So, you know, all of this that I've just been saying is actually not that bad. It's an 8 out of 10. It's a pretty decent score for something that's a first crack out of the box, and considering the issues I had with this car. Again, if ARRMA had not made these incremental improvements, the scoring here would be quite different. Now, before we go, I do want to end this video with my final thoughts on the Kraton 8S. Now, earlier this year, I did a video about my experience with the car and telling the story about where it had been and how it had to go back to the UK and how I had to bend chassis and all that sort of thing. And I know that some people thought that that was my review of the Kraton. Not the case at all. It was really just me sharing my thoughts based on the initial experience that I had with this car. Because to be honest, it did let me down a little bit. You know, it didn't have a lot of speed. I had the bent chassis issue, and it just wasn't the performance that I was sort of expecting out of this car. Since then, ARRMA have done quite a number of updates to this vehicle, such as the radio, the bracing, and everything else that we've talked about here in during this review. So my perspective on it has changed quite a bit because ARRMA are listening. They are making corrections. Now, I know that some people criticize them, saying, well, they should have done that before the car launched. They should have done this. They should have done that. but it has been a learning experience for them, and it's also been a learning experience for a lot of customers out there as well. And I have no doubt that future incarnations of this car will be a lot better. So my perspective of this car has changed quite a bit, especially since I've done some updates with this, such as the MTC chassis, the bracing update, and of course now I'm running a 5th scale power system in here, which is of course the Max 5 combo. That changes things quite a bit, and it gives this car a lot of potential. And that's the one thing that, whether you have an earlier version of this or whether you're looking for the next one when they become available again, just know that there is a lot of potential here. There aren't a lot of cars like this out there on the market. There's not a lot of, well, there's no other 1/5 scale truggies as far as I'm aware, at least not a popular brand like this. Maybe there's some off-brand out there or some clone of something, but something as big as this, a Kraton, a truggy, there really isn't anything out there like this. And I have to, hand it to ARRMA for taking the leap of faith that they did and putting this guy on the market when they did. The argument again can be had that maybe they should have waited another 6 months, or they should have done this or that, but I think they did an exceptional job, all things considered. There's a lot of engineering on this car. There's a lot of things that they've thought of, things that, even when I was working on the car, swapping out the chassis, you pick up on these little nuances, these little things that they've done, which is so good. There's a lot of really good engineers at ARRMA, and I have to take my hat off to them. Now, they didn't get this right from the get-go. We need to be reminded of that. They didn't get it right, and they're still making improvements. They're still making changes. And I cannot wait to see what they do with the next one. And which kind of leads me to one more thing. The Outcast 8S. I kind of had the hint that the Outcast 8S was going to come out pretty much straight after this was launched. There was a lot going on, a lot of whispers going on that there was an Outcast in the works. And I was actually quite surprised that it took as long as it did for them to release the car. Because I figured, well, all you got to do is just bring out a shorter chassis and it's on the market, it's done. Surely you must have the truck ready. But I think they held off. I have no inside information on this. I just think they held off for as long as they did, because they wanted to make sure that they did some more testing on this car, such as the bracing and everything else. And so when the Outcast 8S came out, there was none of these issues, or at least they eliminated the issues that this one had. They've eliminated on that. Now, that's not to say that the Outcast is not going to have its own set of problems. It might, but at least from my understanding, from what I can see as an outsider now, it looks as though they delayed the release of that truck to make sure they had it right, and they didn't have negative feedback on it as much as they did with this car, at least from me. So that's where I'm going to leave this review, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you got something out of it. And I have to thank everybody for their support, continuous support to the channel, to me, for everybody that's helped me. Getting the gearing right on this car, helped me out with the chassis, everything. I have to thank everybody that, and of course ARRMA and Horizon, because they were responsible for me having this one pre-released. So big shout out to them as well, even though, we've sort of gone our own separate ways, but hopefully they watch this review and they can see where my perspective is and where I'm coming from with it. And they appreciate my feedback, no matter what the future holds. Thank you again for watching. Please be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and check the video description. More links to my social media pages, links to previous videos, all that good stuff. And I'll be speaking to you all next time.